Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking some time away from your day to join us on our webinar. We're going to talk today about predictive intelligence and about monitoring of social media, monitoring of internet traffic, open source information, and we're going to talk about it as a means to prevention of incidents. So some of you out there may be familiar with traditional social media monitoring. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of what's out there, what's being done, what should be being done, and maybe some new ways to think about doing the monitoring in a more effective fashion. So my name is Jason Russell. I am the president of Firestorm Solutions. Firestorm is a full-service security consulting company. We do everything from prevention in terms of site assessments on schools and developing emergency policies for schools and critical incident training for staff of schools. We also do threat assessment, which is working with schools to identify the behaviors of concern of a potential attacker before it gets to the actual attack. And that's really what this is about. And you're going to hear me talk, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the layers and the concept of layers of protection. And predictive intelligence and monitoring is just another layer in the preventative strategy. And as we look at incidents and we kind of go through and look at what has been happening in terms of active shooter events or bullying or self-harm, we see lots of instances where we could have maybe intervened had we been looking in the right areas. So for those of you, obviously, everybody on the webinar today is involved with schools. You know, it makes sense to look for things where you're most likely to find them. And when you're talking about students and you're talking about teenagers, we all know where they communicate. You know, two kids can be in the same room and they probably won't talk directly. They'll send each other messages or communicate virtually. So one of the things that really need to focus on as part of our layers of prevention is leveraging technology to assist us to that end. So that's what we're going to talk about today. About 45 minutes, and as we go through this, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask or type a question there, and we'll make sure we get you an answer. You know, it's about, obviously, when we asked organizations what their concern was with the possibility of having an active violence attack in schools, you know, it was about 92% were either very concerned or somewhat concerned. There wasn't anybody in recent surveys that said they were not at all concerned. So obviously this is something that we're thinking about and parents are thinking about. And as we see events happen, and even over the weekend, we saw what happened in New Zealand and what's happened internationally, it brings up concerns here in the US. So the reality is the current approach that we're using isn't really working because it doesn't focus on intervening earlier in the process. Studies have shown that the people that commit active violence or active shooter attacks, they don't do this on a whim. They do it at the end of a path. And one of the interesting aspects of what we do for prevention is we rarely focus on the path, and we always focus on the day of the event. So when you look at how resources are spent for safety and security, we usually have very few layers, and the layers are always skewed towards the day of the actual attack. So it's things like locks and physical security and maybe armed, you know, guards or police officers or whatever that might be. And what we found is, although those can be effective many times, it would be much better if we could also focus earlier in that path. So a layered approach is really what we want to try to think about. So, you know, we'll talk a little bit about how this concept of monitoring of social media, not only in terms of an active violence attack, but in terms of a lot of different issues that can come up in schools, it can be a really important feature to add. You know, the sole focus on physical security is really hampering real prevention strategies. It's unfortunate that when we look at some of the grant money and some of the things that are done for school safety, it's always physical security. And what I have found in my over 20 years of being involved in law enforcement and security, I spent a good portion of my career as a Secret Service agent, and most of the consultants at Firestorm Solutions are former Secret Service agents, so we are really focused on preventative, making sure that something bad doesn't happen. Physical security is where most organizations spend their money, and the reason is because it's tangible. We can touch it. It's much harder to buy, a program, a threat assessment program, or something that we can't physically touch. So schools tend to buy things they can touch. They buy cameras, and they buy, locks, and they buy things like that. But the reality is, if you look at attacks, none of those things have really prevented or helped in one of the attack situations. So we want to try to get as early as possible in the preventative stages, in early as possible in the path to prevent an attack. And the really interesting thing about security is when it's done right, nothing happens. In other words, if you're preventing incidents, if you're actually doing the prevention and doing the interventions in a way that is effective, you're not likely to have an incident. And what's even more interesting is when a school or the district doesn't have an incident, they rarely credit the lack of incidents to the prevention. Instead, they feel more like the money spent on prevention was wasted and they would have never had an incident in the first place. So actually, security is one of the few industries that if you're doing it right, you can easily work yourself out of a job because people don't think, they think maybe it wasn't necessary to begin with. And that often breeds complacency. So we don't have events, maybe we have a really good threat assessment program. We're identifying kids that are exhibiting warning signs early, maybe even as early as middle school. We're applying intervention strategies to get them off that path to violence. And then when we don't have an incident, we seldom credit that to the fact that we have a good policy, but we credit it to, maybe the incident would have never happened anyways. We always hear the post-event commentary. We hear afterwards what people say. It's pretty common. It's amazing what hindsight does to an incident and how we're really able to pick up on these warning signs once the incident has happened. If only we would focus on doing that before the incident, maybe we would never have the incident in the first place. And one of the main areas where we see communication related to violence in schools is online. Kids communicate online, therefore, they're likely to communicate their intent and their violent intentions online as well. So, the things that somebody posts, kids nowadays are immune to it. Many years ago, it never occurred to us that there would be every word you ever spoke, every picture you ever took has the possibility of being held and maintained forever. And we're essentially numb to it. So kids tend to share and they overshare. And that gives us an opportunity to apply some prevention. So when we looked at the FBI did a recent study on active shooter attacks, and they found that 16% of the attacks situations, there had been some public sharing. In other words, online public sharing of information, and that 16% doesn't delineate which attacks. So, for instance, Parkland, which had quite a number of fatalities, there was a lot of information that could or would have been readily available online regarding that attacker that was either missed or just, fell through the cracks. So while the percentage, 16%, sounds maybe not like a large percentage to you, if I was to tell you that you could go save 16% of the kids or have the opportunity to prevent 16% of these attacks, I don't think there's anybody on this call that wouldn't think that that was a valuable thing to take. We see direct threats online, which to me, missing a direct threat online is just unconscionable. We can't miss what's right in front of our faces. We have to really be looking for these things. And unfortunately, many times these attacks are preceded by direct threats. Many times, and we, I keep referring to active shooter situations, but think about bullying situations. Think about fights at your sporting events. Think about, incidents at your prom, at your homecoming. We see direct communication about circumstances that are going to happen at these events that we just missed because we're not looking for them. Veiled threats, Veiled threats are not, you're not communicating directly what you're going to do, but your language or the context of what you're saying might lead a reasonable person to believe you have some nefarious or ill intent. Shared threats, and what that means is many times the person who's actually looking to launch the attack or to do the violence might not share, but somebody who knows them or somebody who is attached to them on social media may share what they have heard. And once again, because that's how kids communicate, they often share it online. And then obviously the behaviors of concern. As we look through some of the social media and some of the internet and some of the comments and the things that we see lots of reporting, self-reporting of behaviors of concern, whether it be weapon ownership or homicidal tendencies or self-harm warnings, where kids are talking about hurting themselves in the run-up to possibly a suicide attempt. So we need to look everywhere we can for these warning signs, and social media and online is obviously a pretty obvious location for us to be searching for these. So most of the time it's not random, it's targeted. People know, and when they know, they talk. Obviously, if you have a social media page and parents get to talking or people get talking online, those things can get pretty out of control. And this is the way that people communicate. People share everything. I mean, you can go on your Facebook page or you can go on your Twitter and people are taking pictures of the food they eat. They're sharing, and many times oversharing. It's almost an epidemic. I wrote a recent article about kind of the epidemic of sharing. If that's the case, then why aren't we leveraging that tendency of people to share to look for these warning signs? So we're going to talk as we get through this thing about kind of how that works. Who's listening? Obviously, everybody's listening, and hopefully we're listening. And, we'll talk a little bit about some of the concerns that schools and organizations have when it comes to social media monitoring, many of which are unfounded, but it's just that idea of, should we be listening to what our students are talking about? Should we be looking at these situations? And quite frankly, I think the real question would be, how can we not? We can't continue to ignore the warning signs. So how does it work? There are dozens and dozens of technologies out there. There are dozens and dozens of platforms out there that can help you in monitoring the social media and the internet and publicly available information. And how that works is these platforms are built with artificial intelligence and they're built with algorithms. So they're constantly indexing not only social media applications, but the internet as a whole. So they're constantly looking for the information that they're set out to search for. And this is happening, either in real time or at regular intervals. So it's a constant process of gathering of that information and then passing it on to somebody who can analyze it. And that's really where the weakness is in social media monitoring. So they use keywords or phrases. So many times you'll see, if you're monitoring, you're going to look for phrases that are indicative of an attack or indicative of somebody being harmed. In our platform that we use, we have 300 built-in keywords and phrases related to potential violence. It's the largest, automatically available database. We use 300. We also use exceptions. One of the issues you find if you've been involved in social media monitoring of any kind is that you have a lot of false positives. So you'll have the word shoot or shooter, and you'll get a lot of references to, basketball, and the kid was a lethal three-point shooter. Well, that has nothing to do with an attack, and it's a false positive, but it's picking up on keywords. So one of the things that we've built into our program is the concept of making sure that exceptions are considered so that we're not getting as many false positives. We can also put in phrases, school names, names of particular people. So whether it's a superintendent or a principal or maybe a student who's being bullied or a student who's being expelled or as a particular behavioral issue. So pretty much our platform that we work with has unlimited keywords and phrases, which means we can put in as many keywords and phrases as we want. We can put in as many names, as many acronyms. So oftentimes we'll put in things that are unique to your district. So maybe you have a gang in the area. Maybe you have a nickname that people call a certain school. We'd obviously want to put those things into the phrases so that they would be picked up on if somebody started to talk about them. Geofencing, what geofencing is, it's basically establishing boundaries. So think about it as a fence, basically. It's putting a fence around a particular location or group of locations, and any publicly available information within that geofence can be picked up on. Okay, so any threats, any mentions of the school, we can actually geofence and pick up every communication that comes out of a particular area. So oftentimes we'll do this before athletic events. We'll do it, many times we'll geofence the schools themselves in addition to adding the keywords, just to make sure that we've covered as much as we can in terms of making sure everything is monitored. Now, one of the things you'll also want to make sure is that you have the ability, once you get a concern or once you find something that may be a concern, you're going to want to have the ability to do a deeper dive search. Merely getting the basic information might not be enough. You may need to do a deeper dive search on a screen name or a location or a particular person's name or a school name. So you want to try to make sure that whatever platform you choose has the ability to conduct a deeper dive search, and that should be included with what you get. And then you'll also want to make sure that you can do a dark or deep web searches. Now, one of the things to understand is the dark web and the deep web are different. Okay, the deep web is a little bit easier to access than the dark web, but you want to have the ability, if necessary, to access both of those. If you have an investigation that you're conducting, if you have a threat assessment that you're conducting, you'll want to be using and working with a partner that has the ability to use both of those opportunities for further investigation. And that's pretty difficult. You really have to understand what you're doing to be able to get to the deep and dark web. The real problem with, if any of you are doing monitoring, you found probably that it's very labor intensive. And the reason it's labor intensive is because it's basically a software program. It has a fairly good brain, but it's going to give you a lot of information. And if you looked at the amount of information that is really gleaned in social media and digital monitoring, it's probably 99% of it is not useful. So if you look at the slide here, basically the way monitoring has been done traditionally is really the right side there, which is the client and the monitor. So you have the software is sending you a bunch of information, and then the client is then digging through that information to find out, is there anything useful in here? Is there anything that I can use? Is there anything concerning? It's essentially like me giving you a gold mine without any of the equipment that you need to sift through the rocks and the dirt to get to the gold. You have to do it by hand, and it's very labor intensive. And because the number of false positives are so high, people tend to find it not very useful. And the unfortunate thing is that's not acceptable, because the 1% that is useful has to be found. We cannot miss this 1%. And we have schools that just don't have the resources to do this. So what we suggest and what we do is actually a little bit different. We actually have kind of a several different faceted monitoring. We suggest that whether you were to consider talking to us about helping you with monitoring or going with another service, you look at this process, because this is the process you want. When we monitor, when we assist a client, we do all of the monitoring ourselves. We take it completely out of their hands. And you want to find a service that does the monitoring for you 24/7, which means you should not be sifting through thousands and thousands of tweets that maybe were left over the weekend Maybe you missed them and now it's Monday morning and you find a tweet about a bomb threat that you should have found out about Saturday morning. So it's important to have 24/7 monitoring, and there are very few school districts that have the resources to do that effectively because it takes diligence. We actually have monitors monitoring our clients 24/7, 365. They are constantly, we have analysts that are monitoring that information. When our analysts who are trained, when they find something that is of concern, they bring it to one of our security consultants. So in your situation, if you're doing this on your own, it's going to be maybe your director of security, somebody like that. And our security consultants then bring that issue to the client and say, basically, here's the problem, and here's what you need to do about it. And I think that's probably the most missed piece when you look at social media monitoring is it's really great for me to give you a problem, and that's helpful for me to say, hey, here's a threat and you need to do something. But what's even more helpful is for me to say, here's a threat and here's what we need to do about this threat. Here's how we need to deal with this situation. Here's what we need to do to manage this threat. Now, we are able to do this because the background of our security consultants, that's what we did. We come from the Secret Service where we're constantly assessing threats and determining the risks. If you're able to do this on your own, it's going to be your security director. There needs to be somebody who is working with the district, working with the school to help them manage that threat. So that middle piece is extremely important. The bottom piece, which is the intelligence analyst, that's pretty important too because it takes the work out of the client's hands. But that middle piece, that expert, is really quite a differentiator because currently a lot of places you find a threat and you may have an idea of how to deal with it. But if you're not doing threat assessment and dealing with threats on a daily basis, there's a lot of things that you can do wrong. So you want to try to get some expertise involved in that process. Now, the other thing that we suggest is you also have the ability for the client, for the school, when they have a concern that they found. Maybe they heard information from a student in the hallway about another student who was talking about, bringing a gun to school or talking about hurting themselves or talking about a fight coming up at a football game. What we also can do is have the client bring specific concerns to us, and then we can then investigate that concern. We can then start targeting a particular person, a particular location, and work with them to investigate that situation. So the way monitoring should work is it should work both directions. You should be getting the information from the service, and you should be able to provide information to the service so that you can really do a deeper dive and help them resolve situations. It's extremely important. And right now, basically what's happening, and the reason if you have monitoring, you don't find it useful is because you're probably doing the monitoring. You shouldn't be doing that. It should be taken care of for you. You want to listen. So you want to obviously target social media that contains specific words and phrases. So like we talked about, those keywords, those key phrases, those things to look for. We have 300 of them, and we also have unlimited additional. So we can add as many keywords or phrases that are needed to make sure we don't miss anything. You want to look. So that's your geofencing, or that's your kind of deep dive. So maybe it's like I said, an event. We have a graduation coming up. We have, the overnight graduation party. We have maybe the kids are going on a field trip and we want to monitor situations. We have the ability to actually add that to the monitoring to make sure that we've covered everything. And that's obviously the geofencing we talked about, which is that kind of deeper dive, predict, keywords and phrases, all those things. We can also obviously want to isolate a specific message. So if we can find, if we maybe get a hit on a potentially threatening phrase, we can actually do a deep dive just on that person. And many times we're able to find out a lot of additional information that can help prevent an incident, whether it's a suicide, a fight, a bullying situation, whatever it might be. Or a specific person. This is where a lot of schools really have sometimes they they cringe a little bit, but the reality is it's not responsible when you have the ability to do this to not do it, especially if you think there's a danger. Now, we don't suggest you monitor kids for disciplinary reasons, but we do suggest if you have a concern that this kid could be a danger to himself or others, that you do everything in your power to try to prevent that and try to do what you can just like you would put a camera in a hallway to watch how kids behave. This is really no different. It's just, it's monitoring another form of communication. And then once you determine that you do have an issue, you really want to make sure you have a management and an escalation strategy. What do we do once we find something? If you are doing the monitoring on your own, you are going to get frustrated because you're going to find 99% of what you get is not worthwhile. And many times that leads people to quit. And unfortunately, that's a mistake because you're going to miss the few times where it is really valuable. And I can tell you that we have several hundred schools, maybe several hundred districts at this point. We have, under protection, we have almost 500,000 kids on our first site program that we're going to talk about here in a minute. And we are dealing with daily incidents at our schools, daily. Not all severe threats, but we are dealing with daily incidents with our clients, whether it's a behavioral issue, a bullying issue, a self-harm issue. We're doing deep dive searches. We're constantly working back and forth with our clients, and we're providing them actually monthly reports on their monitoring, so they understand what's going on within their social media monitoring platform. If you don't, this is where the threat assessment process comes in. Many times these threats that we'll find will lead to that next step, which is, okay, now we need to do the threat assessment, which is something also, if you don't have a threat assessment in place, highly encourage you to call and talk to us or try to talk with somebody where you can get a threat assessment program in place, because it really is important. Once we have the threat, what do we do about it? And, merely identifying it. You look at Parkland, unfortunately, there was a lot of missed opportunities there for intervention. They expelled the kid, but they didn't expel the problem. And that's really unfortunate, but that's the nature of kind of how threat assessment has traditionally been done in schools, and we want to really change that. Now, there are limitations. The reality is there is no perfect solution to this. There is no perfect silver bullet. And anybody that you talk to that does social media, if you start calling platforms and software companies, you need to really push them on the limitations, because they're not going to bring them up immediately. They're just not, because they don't want to tell you that there's weaknesses in their system. But the reality is there is weaknesses. First of all, you can only get openly sourced information. You cannot get into people's private accounts. You can't get into people's private Facebook accounts. You can't get into people's private Snapchat accounts. You just can't. Nobody can. You need specific law enforcement reasons. You need a search warrant. You need something above and beyond just that kind of monitoring to get into these private accounts. Anybody that tells you that they can is not being truthful with you. They cannot do it without court orders. If I'm doing geofencing, the location services on the person's phone must be turned on, because if not, the carrier doesn't know where the person is. Now, most of the time, we found that people do have their location services turned on because they're using their maps and they're using other things. But if you're doing geofencing and the location services are turned off, you will not get a hit. You just won't. So that's just the reality. 99% of the stuff that comes across is noise. It's useless. It's nothing. It's mindless, constant tweeting. It's mindless, constant posting. It's comments. It's internet chat. It's all these other things. And it has nothing to do with threats, and it has nothing to do with anything that we necessarily need or want to know about. But the 1% that is valuable is too valuable to miss. It's just too valuable. So it goes back to my mining example. If I told you that in that big hill over there, there's a diamond somewhere, you got to go find it. It's worthwhile enough for you to spend a little time to go through that dirt and sift through to try to find that diamond, because it's so valuable. And this is the same thing. We cannot miss the 1% that is valuable because we don't have the wherewithal to deal with the other noise. And one of the things that taking the monitoring out of the client's hands does is it eliminates the annoyance of the noise on the client's side. We deal with the noise. Monitoring the funnel, I always describe it as a funnel. You want the funnel to be as large as possible at the top. So if you think about that top of that funnel in that picture, the wider I can make the top of that funnel, the less likely I am to miss something that might be dumped in that area, right? So that funnel's wide, anything that comes around that funnel is going to end up being caught inside, and hopefully out the other end will come the useful information. But what happens when people get annoyed with their social media monitoring, or they start to find it useful, is they start to really get more detailed on what they want to see, and they make the funnel so small that they risk missing stuff. And it's understandable why they do that, because they're getting so much noise. But the reality is, the smaller you make the funnel, the more likely you are to miss something that can be valuable, which is why, once again, outsourcing the actual physical monitoring becomes a real game changer. Monitoring needs to be done 24/7. We see many examples, especially with our clients that we're doing our first site program on now, that things come in on the weekend. We're managing threats, every day. So we're managing threats over the weekend. We're managing things that come in on a consistent basis, and we can't take a chance that we miss something and then it's on our dashboard when we come in Monday morning, and we should have known about it, Friday night. And we also need to have a threat assessment in place. Once we find something, what do we do? And really having somebody who can help you manage those threats is critical. If you were to Google social media monitoring services right now, you're going to get 15 or 20 Google pages with a bunch of different services on them. So you'll want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. So just real quick about our program, because I think it really is unique. We started this first site program in December of 2018. So it's fairly new, but like I said, we already have hundreds and hundreds of schools, and there's many reasons. First of all, because we know how to manage threats, we know what we're doing, and because we've outsourced and we've taken the monitoring out of the school's hands, and we really made it a much easier process for them, and we've been able to do it at a very reasonable price. We're monitoring right now a school $1,500 a year to monitor a school, and that's per school per year. So, and generally we're only monitoring high schools and middle schools, and we're actually many times able to take the names of the elementary schools and use them as keywords in the streams for the elementary or the middle schools and the high schools. So pretty reasonable, and really we wanted to make it a no-brainer. And all the things that I've described to you are part of that process. So you get the assistance of our analysts, you get the assistance of our threat assessment when you do have an issue, you get the 24/7, you get the reporting. It really is quite a comprehensive program. It is the most comprehensive program that exists, full stop. There is nothing else like it that exists. And really it comes from the fact that we know how to do this. We've been doing this for many, many years, and understanding that this is the way to prevention. This is one of the layers that needs to be employed to prevent these types of attacks. It's about looking for those warning signs. Okay, so a little bit ahead of schedule here, which is always good. I'm going to give you back your day a little bit faster maybe than you had anticipated. I do want to encourage you to please consider taking a look at our first site program. Like I mentioned, I gave you the price. It doesn't change. It's pretty reasonable, and we hope to be able to get as many schools and protect as many schools as possible. We've prevented some very significant incidents already, and we're really proud of that. Some that had media attention, and it's based on the fact that we really do know what we're doing, and we take this very seriously, and it's personal for us. It really is. So if you get a chance and you want any more information, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm going to give you my email address. It's jrussell, RUSSELL, @firestorm.com. That's jrussell@firestorm.com. You can also email me anytime with any security questions you have, period. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm a parent first and foremost, so I take school security very seriously, and I'm always available to help and happy to do so. So with that, I'm going to give you back the rest of your Monday, and thank you very much for attending.